2023 has been a banger year for video games so far. We're only at the halfway point yet, and there has already been a constant stream of incredible games to keep up with. And looking ahead at the next 6 months, it's clear that the momentum isn't going to slow down. Halfway through the year though, it's time to take a pause and take stock of the year thus far, and maybe turn our attention to some of the games that haven't met expectations. To that end, here we're going to talk about a few games of 2023 that have disappointed us in more ways than one. REDFALL. REDFALL always looked like it was going to be a very different kind of game from Arcane's traditional offerings, but the general expectation was that given the studio's innate talent and impeccable track record, it would at least be good. A well put together game. But in the end, it definitely wasn't. Not only does REDFALL almost completely lack the strength that one usually associates an Arcane game with, it's not even good at the new things it tries, with everything from its open world and its co-op gameplay to its loot mechanics coming with major issues. Add to that all of the significant technical hiccups, and what you have is a game that woefully falls short of expectations for an Arcane joint. The Lord of the Rings GOLLUM. Let's be fair here. No one really expected The Lord of the Rings GOLLUM to be anything more than middling or passably enjoyable at best, but we also didn't expect it to be literally one of the worst games in recent memory. Daedalic Entertainment's stealth action-adventure game took its sweet time to finally release, and when it did, it stumbled with its first step and fell flat on its face. Nothing about The Lord of the Rings GOLLUM works. It has a boring quest design, little to no exploration, broken combat and traversal mechanics, and a deluge of technical and performance problems that make it nigh impossible to get through. You don't play Lord of the Rings GOLLUM, you endure it. Layers of Fear. For a while, Bloober Team has been pumping out psychological horror games that range from middling to genuinely good, and this year, the studio went back to the very beginning to bring back Layers of Fear, combining, connecting, and reimagining the first two games while adding its own new content on top. The new Layers of Fear looks excellent and has a fascinating premise, but as is often the case with Bloober, it doesn't do justice to that premise. It ends up being a fairly dull, repetitive, and rote game that relies on its visual prowess to the exclusion of almost everything else. We can only hope that Silent Hill 2 remake fares significantly better. Chia. We'd had our eye on Chia for a while before it launched, with Awaseb's tropical action-adventure game looking increasingly promising with each of its pre-launch showings. And though the final product is certainly not without its merits, it didn't quite live up to our expectations. Yes, it has a gorgeous setting, and making your way around the island is fun for the most part, but the game's mechanics and systems never quite managed to get their hooks in, leaving us with a pretty but fairly unremarkable experience. Crime Boss ROCKAY City. Over the years, many have tried their hand at the co-op first-person shooter heist genre, and very few have managed to enjoy the kind of success that Payday series has seen. Crime Boss ROCKAY City was certainly eyeing that throne, and with its star-studded cast of actors, it looked like it might actually take a big swing. The game itself, however, was not only disappointing, it was just downright terrible. Whether you're playing its single-player roguelike campaign or diving into its co-op offerings, the game's aggressive mediocrity taints every second you spend with it, with its awful voice acting, bland design, repetitive loop, and boring core gameplay dragging down the experience into the doldrums. RAVENBOUND. RAVENBOUND has a promising premise on paper as an open-world roguelite set in a world inspired by Scandinavian folklore, but when you actually get down to playing the game, you realize that it's woefully underbaked in almost every way that matters. Its world is a vast one, but given how empty, bland, and vapid it generally feels, exploration ends up being significantly de-emphasized. Combat can get repetitive instead of decent enemy variety, while the game also does itself no favors with its poorly balanced difficulty curves. Add to that an unfortunately healthy dose of technical issues, and you get a pretty underwhelming game. FORSPOKEN. A big new AAA open-world IP from Square Enix? To say that people were curious to see how Forspoken would fare would be an understatement, even back when it was called Project Athia. Though, unfortunately, it didn't even come close to matching expectations. A premise that's interesting on paper is let down by annoying characters and poor writing. An open world that should have been begging to be explored ended up being empty and uninteresting. The combat system, while flashy and enjoyable, failed to make up for the deficiencies in boring quest design. The fact that Forspoken failed to meet Square Enix's commercial expectations was ultimately not surprising in the slightest. The Last of Us Part 1 PC. Frankly, we're still baffled that this was allowed to exist. Naughty Dog, more than almost any other studio in the entire industry, is associated with an obsessive level of attention to detail and quality assurance. Polish and Naughty Dog go hand in hand, which is why it's so surprising that The Last of Us' Part 1 PC port might be the worst PC port in recent memory. Even looking at a brief clip online and individual screenshots, it was hard to believe that something this broken had been allowed to release. When you actually played it, it quickly became apparent that the state of the game was somehow even worse. It's a real shame, too, because this will forever be remembered as the manner in which the legendary franchise made its PC debut. LEGO 2K Drive. Unlike many other games on this list, LEGO 2K Drive is not without its merits. Its world is vibrant and colorful, it has an impressive suite of customization options for building any kind of car you want, and as you'd expect from a LEGO game, it's very kid-friendly and easy to get into. It is, however, also quite vapid. What you see is very much what you get, and with that lack of depth, LEGO 2K Drive ends up like a shallow experience that runs out of steam too quickly. Whether that's because of how uninteresting its open-world exploration is, or its lackluster optional content, or just any number of other issues. Leap. Leap isn't exactly a game that's grabbed a whole lot of headlines, so to say that expectations were high wouldn't exactly be fair. But this is still very much a game that doesn't do justice to its interesting premise. The sci-fi competitive FPS boasts slick visuals and cool traversal options. But all of that gets bogged down in its tedious gameplay loop and how unsatisfying its moment-to-moment gameplay largely feels. Especially in a genre that's this competitive, Leap fails to make a mark in any meaningful way. Strayed Lights. We don't want to be unfair on Strayed Lights here, because for a game developed by a small team with a unique vision, it does actually get some things right. The story, the music, and the aesthetic, for instance, are legitimately solid and worthy of praise. There's plenty else in the game, however, that drags the experience down. From its frustrating combat to the lackluster platform to its technical issues, the fact that there are parts of the game that are genuinely good makes the parts that aren't feel that much more frustrating. Stray Blade. You'll never see us turning down the chance to play a new Souls-like, especially one that's trying to shake up the genre's formula the way that Stray Blade was promising it would. But, though there's something to be said about the idea of viewing the genre through a less gloomy lens, the actual execution of many of the game's core pillars leaves a lot to be desired. The clunky controls, the uninspired level design, and technical issues combine to make Stray Blade quite a frustrating experience, even if it isn't one that's totally without its merits. Crash Team Rumble. Again, in the name of fairness, it's worth pointing out that Crash Team Rumble is definitely a game that you can have plenty of fun with, especially for fans of the series given how well it translates that Crash feel into a MOBA experience. As it stands right now, though, it's also pretty bare bones, with its launch offerings, especially in terms of the modes on offer, being quite limited. Of course, we're hoping that Crash Team Rumble will be supported so well that including it on this list in retrospect feels like a mistake, but with the live service games, you can never really tell how long of a lifespan to expect. GREYHILL Incident. A small production in every way possible, criticizing GREYHILL Incident would almost feel unfair under most circumstances. But unfortunately, there's plenty to criticize in this game. The core premise of a survival horror game where your main enemies are aliens is certainly an interesting one, but from its awful dialogue to its painfully shallow mechanics to the mind-numbing level design, GREYHILL Incident messes up, to say the very least, in too many ways to be anything more than a disappointment. And even that might be a generous description. Risen. In the many years since its launch, the original Risen has amassed a reputation as one of the RPG genre's proper diamonds in the rough. Though with its 2023 port, there was way more of the rough than there was of the diamond. Janky animations, disappointing and minimal updates to the gameplay and visuals, clunky combat, and technical problems combined to paint the aging experience in what wasn't exactly the most flattering light. Maybe this is one flawed gem that should have been left in the past. Hey, did you know that we at GamingBolt upload new videos every day? Stick around, drop a like, subscribe, and hit that bell, and let us know what kind of content you'd like to see in the future with a comment below.